Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And it's great to see everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us on during this online conference from IES. It's great to see some folks here some folks' names I recognize and others who are new. So I've been asked to serve as a moderator for this panel, and we hope to have what we think will be an interesting and stimulating conversation about inspiring new collaborations between methodologists and substantive researchers, particularly in the topic of adult education. This is a methodological topic that I've been really interested in, and so I hope this will be the start of many more conversations like this. First, what I want to do is turn this over to Meredith Larson, who is the IES Program Officer for Post-Secondary and Adult Education. About 10 years ago, Meredith organized a meeting trying to start the conversation between methodological and adult ed researchers, and she's been thinking about this issue for a long time. And she organized this panel today. So I'd love to start and have Meredith talk a little bit about some of her inspirations and goals for organizing this session.
Thank you so much, Vivian. It's lovely to see everybody today. And who knows, like if this is a lot of fun, maybe we'll replicate this with other areas of understudied populations or settings, because there's a lot of opportunity here to not only improve knowledge for particular students or particular programs, but also to improve research methods writ large. So back in April of 2012, MCR hosted IES's first technical working group on adult education. And the purpose was to hear from state directors, applied researchers, and methodologists about the critical issues for the field, types of research questions being asked or that could be asked, and the methodological tools to address the obstacles for doing the work. In the past decade, IES has increased its investment in adult education research, but it still lags significantly behind other areas. Despite the importance of adult foundational skills and data suggesting anywhere from 20 to 60% of the US adult population may be struggling or at risk for low literacy or numeracy skills, less than 2% of IES's field-initiated research spending has gone to studying this area. And a major hurdle to conducting the work and to building the knowledge is finding the right designs and analyses for the questions in the complex settings and populations of adult education. But like all major hurdles, this challenge is also an exciting opportunity to enrich the field of research methods and statistics. So a goal for today's conversation is to spur interest and to encourage at least one of you to reach out to an applied researcher if you're a methodologist, or to a methodologist if you're an applied researcher, and build a meaningful longer-term partnership that benefits both adult education research and the development of new methods, tools, and analyses for all research. So as a shout out to all my methodological friends in the room, if you're the type that hears it's too hard, or there's no way to evaluate this, or we don't have the right methods, and your heart rolls up its sleeves, then hold on. You're gonna have an exciting ride into the world of adult education. And with that, I'm gonna shift it back to Vivian. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Meredith, for that introduction. Okay, so our plan for this session is that after our panel introductions, I'm just going to spend a few minutes and offer some very high-level framing comments about my observations as a methodologist. And then I hope that we will spend the bulk of the time hearing from our panelists about their perspectives and the types of research challenges that they encounter. And hopefully the challenges that they face might serve as inspiration for potential collaborations for future methodological and adult ed researchers. Our panelists today represent a wide breadth and depth of work in the area of adult education. And let's go ahead and have our panelists introduce themselves. So Judy, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Vivian. I'm Judy Allen-Perez, and I am a principal scientist at Apt Associates based here in the DC area. And I've been doing adult education research for about 40 years and on a variety of topics. And currently I'm working on a couple of projects that are IES funded. One is I'm a co-principal investigator for the CREATE network that Stephanie leads here. And I'm also working on the Second Chance Pell study that is being funded by IES. And I recently also finished 2 studies on text messaging, looking at prompts for adult learners.
Great. Thanks, Judy. Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Stephanie Cronin, a managing researcher at the American Institutes for Research in the DC area. And I have been involved in adult education research for about 25 years now. And currently I have the pleasure of working with Judy and Daphne and Meredith and others through the IES-funded Create Adult Skills Networks research network, including as the network lead and one of the R&D teams. I also am project director for the National Reporting System for Adult Education Support for the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. I'll turn it over to Daphne.
And Daphne.
Sure, thank you. So I'm a professor at Georgia State University, and I'm also the director of the Adult Literacy Research Center at Georgia State. And I guess my history in terms of doing adult literacy research is in between Stephanie and Judy. I don't know exactly the number of years, but somewhere in the middle. And right now, I'm currently involved with a few IES-funded projects focusing all on adult learners, looking at things like writing, civics.
Great. Thanks so much, Daphne. Okay, so for our participants in this session, because this is meant to be a place to sort of generate potential collaborations, if you haven't entered your contact information, please feel free to do so. Feel free also to enter any comments or questions that you have in the chat or in the Q&A. Meredith and I are going to monitor that and bring those back. And if you don't have your view set on gallery view, you might do that. Otherwise, you might have a headache with whiplash between their different speakers. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes and just offer some comments about some big methodological issues that I think a lot of folks who do methods and stats research has been thinking about, and sort of highlight, I think, some areas for opportunities and collaboration that I think some of these challenges present. So I think, as we all know here, that over the last 20 years, I think the program evaluation and methodological literature has really focused on identifying and estimating average treatment effects for identifying what works. And I think as a discipline, we've gotten really good and made tremendous progress at both developing those methods as well as teaching those methods for identifying average treatment effects. However, as you guys all know, there's been considerable movement to consider also what works for whom and under what conditions, as articulated and codified by the SEER standards. And I think the premise here is the recognition that contextual characteristics, such as the population served, the process for how the interventions are actually delivered, and the settings under which we conduct our studies and deliver our interventions, matter a great deal in understanding program effects in field settings, because we think that they might have a critical role in potentially amplifying or dampening the magnitude of intervention effects. However, I think our methods for identifying, testing, and understanding these sources of effect heterogeneity or moderators are only beginning just to emerge. I think the current literature examining effect heterogeneity focus a lot on sort of examining effect heterogeneity across research sites, as well as by looking at potential moderated effects by looking at sort of common demographic characteristics of participants. But as you all know, if you've worked in field settings, you know that effects can really vary by participant characteristics, treatment conditions, outcome settings in multiple and complex ways. And we still don't have a lot of great methods for identifying and testing these really complex sources of variation that might limit the generalizability of our effect estimates. And this seems especially relevant in adult education, given the tremendous variation that we see in our population characteristics, as well as our settings and the types of interventions that get delivered. And then you add on top of that the logistical challenges that suggest that in order for us to be able to examine effect heterogeneity well, requires really large sample sizes because from our sort of power analyses. So how do we address these challenges? Well, I would like to put out there, I think we need at least 3 things at sort of to start the conversation, right? So first, I think we need a whole new set of methods and statistical approaches for planning and organizing, not just one study, but multiple studies that are related that are on the same topic that we think are of national importance. And that these multiple studies will be carried out by a group of coordinated teams of researchers. So I think what this means is that we're going to need new research designs and methods for planning and analyzing now multiple studies in order to begin to start to identify systematic sources of variation that we wish to test. Second, I think we're going to also need infrastructure, particular data infrastructure for collecting and processing data that includes our traditional measures, but might also include other types of metadata that can be gathered from learning platforms, conversations in classrooms, and administrative data. And then finally, I think we need to think about new team science approaches that incentivize diverse researchers and stakeholders to work collaboratively together to plan and organize studies. Currently, our approach to research is about supporting and rewarding research that is based on competitive models of individual researcher or individual teams of researchers. And I think we need to think about new incentive structures that foster collaborative approaches for designing, implementing, analyzing, and interpreting research studies. And we also need researchers with diverse types of experiences. So substantive experts, methodological experts, but also participants and stakeholders who have deep, rich contextual knowledge of what's happening in the field. This all sounds really challenging, but I think that we also have some examples of this type of collaborative work that is emerging, including the National Study of Learning Mindsets, as well as some of the work that I'm engaging in with Brian Cook and Bill Theron with the Special Education Research Accelerator. Happy to talk about some of these collaborative efforts after in our Q&A session. So with sort of those framing comments in mind, this session is about how we can support and promote collaborative research methods and infrastructure to address the pressing substantive questions and methodological challenges that researchers face in adult learning settings. And to begin generating some ideas, we're going to begin hearing from our panelists about some of the methodological challenges that they have faced and some of the most important pressing research questions that they face. So Daphne, why don't we begin with you? Can you provide us with a little bit of background by offering us just an overview of the types of participants who are often enrolled in adult education programs and just the context of working in adult education systems?
Absolutely, thank you. So I'm going to mainly focus on demographics and background information. And so in addition to the typical gender or racial or ethnic differences that one sees in any setting, in adult education, we see a lot of diversity in other ways as well. In one class, for example, you could have a 16-year-old who's dropped out of high school sitting next to someone in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever age. The students who are attracted to come to adult education come from they come with varied academic skill levels, varied English speaking proficiency levels. They also have different educational level, previous educational levels. Some of our students, went to elementary school, some went to high school, some even went a little past high school. They have varied previous and current education, employment statuses and experiences. Some of them may have also special types of need due to either illnesses or disability, income status, and or incarceration. And then as a last example, some are primary caregivers of children or other family members. And I could go into other diversity issues, but I think that gives enough of an example of that. And you can imagine that these different diverse backgrounds impact their different goals or reasons about why they attend adult education programs. So some of the frequent kinds of goals that they share with us are academic goals. So they may want to increase their academic skills. They may want to get a high school equivalency diploma. They may want to get a vocational certificate, or may want to gain the skills that they'll need in order to enter a post-secondary institution of some sort. Some have work-oriented goals. They want to get attain the academic and soft skills necessary to either find a job, succeed in a job, or get promoted in their current job. Some have civics-related goals. For example, they want to learn the skills that they need in order to pass a citizenship exam. Others have goals related to daily life. For example, digital literacy, or family literacy, or a health literacy skills. I guess the last type of variability that I want to focus on, and actually spend the rest of my time talking about this, is attendance. Our learners often attend, stop, and then come back either to the same class or a different program in a different location. And the reason for that is can really vary in terms of why this happens. For some learners, it is because of difficulties with childcare. It could be difficulties with transportation, constant work schedules changing, or housing difficulties. To give you a taste of this, in a recent study, I found that 91% of the adults all said that keeping a consistent, regular schedule is very important to them. And yet only 21% said that they could keep a weekly schedule that was consistent. And then there's variation in terms of number of minutes or hours they receive, and in the intensity of the dosage they receive. So, for example, one student may receive 100 hours of instruction over a few weeks because they attend consistently, but others may attain the same 100 hours over many weeks, maybe even months, because they attend inconsistently. So there's diversity in terms of that. I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure others have time to also address this question.
Great, thanks, Daphne. Judy, do you want to tell us a little bit about the contextual characteristics of the service delivery systems in adult ed?
Sure, thank you, Vivian. And I'm going to give just a brief overview with the theme, continuing on Daphne's theme of variability, I might add. So the primary federal source of funding for adult education is Title II of the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, which is the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. And that is administered by the U.S. Department of Education. And the U.S. Department of Education, in turn, awards grants to the state agency in each state that is responsible for adult education. And then using a competitive process, the states procure local programs. So it's a flow-through process. And during the 2018-19 program year, which was the one right before the pandemic, there were approximately 1,600 adult education programs that served 1.2 million adult learners that year. So that gives you an idea of the numbers. Although the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act has a number of regulations about services that are should be delivered, states have flexibility in the range of services that they can require their grantees to provide. And then in turn, programs usually have some options in the delivery of adult ed services, such as the types of materials they use in teaching, the format for delivering instruction, and other types. So we can see that this flexibility at the state and local levels contributes to the variability of services and often enters into the difficulty of finding multiple programs within and across states that have business as usual conditions. So that does muddy the waters there. If you look at the types of organizations that provide services, there are three main types. For that same program year, about half of them were adult education, were local education agencies, 29% were community and technical colleges, and then 16% were community-based organizations. So those three organizations serve most of the adults, and there's a smaller number that are in libraries, correctional institutions, and faith-based organizations. So this range of organizations can vary in the resources that are available for adult ed. So for example, if you compare the infrastructure for a community college ABE program that will look a little bit different than a community-based organization, which is totally reliant on soft funding. If we look at the staff, most of the instructors are part-time instructors in adult education, and the required educational credentials and experiences for instructors vary by state or program, but almost all programs require instructors to have at least a bachelor's degree. More recently, there's been some adult education certifications have been developed, and some of the states now are requiring those certificates. Adult education staff have also been hiring staff to serve as either career navigators, coaches, or advisors, because there's been an increase in career pathways programs being implemented and in integrated occupational and training. So the program staffs are now being able to expand. Finally, we have professional development, and the states, through their money from the federal government, are required under the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act to provide professional development to the programs. And there's a lot of flexibility in how they do that. Sometimes they do it themselves, they have contractors, sometimes they actually give extra money to local programs and let the programs direct what they're going to access. The one thing that is mandated is that all program staff need to be able to implement the data collection requirements that are part of the legislation. And so in addition to the state-sponsored professional development, the U.S. Department of Education has the LINKS project, which provides resources, webinars, and training courses. And also the Department of Ed also funds special projects in which adult education staff can learn to implement new practices, such as how to deliver integrated education and training. Another large source for professional development is the Adult Education Professional Association, which also provides webinars and training sessions, as well as national and state conferences. So one of the results, I think, from this varied approach to professional development, even though there are a fair number of sources, is that there's limited consistency within and across states. And furthermore, many things are one-shot activities, and this effort to really have a coherent and cohesive kind of line of professional development hasn't quite materialized in the way that would be more optimal. And so that is kind of the snapshot of those activities.
Great, thank you. And Stephanie, can you tell us just a little bit about the data that is available in adult ed?
Yeah, so much of adult ed, not all of it, but a lot of it is federal and or state funded. And for that reason, it comes with some pretty extensive data collection and reporting requirements that can also be useful for research purposes, such as data on the adult learner background characteristics, enrollment and attendance, pre and post testing of literacy, numeracy, or English language skills, and other learner outcomes like secondary, post-secondary, or occupational credentials, or employment outcomes. Now, the pre and post testing in adult ed serves two different purposes. It's used for initial placement into the most appropriate level courses. And then later, it's used to assess whether or not a learner has progressed to the next educational functioning level in at least one of the skills tested. And in adult ed, there are 6 such functioning levels within ABE, which is for people who are already English speakers, and within ESL. And progressing a level is one of the primary outcomes that programs must report to their states. This type of outcome is usually measured while the learner is still participating in the program, and state policy determines which federally approved standardized assessments can be used for pre and post testing, and the minimum number of contact hours first before post testing can take place. So it's both good and bad because it creates a variation across states, since each state can set those requirements and they can be using different assessments. The longer term program outcomes like obtaining credentials and employment are collected and reported at a range of time points up to about a year after leaving the program. These data are most often collected by the state through data matching to existing data sources. But some states and programs have to use other approaches like surveys for learners who are not represented well in existing data sources. For example, in adult ed, many learners do not have social security numbers. So this is a big challenge for us. And while programs try really hard to follow them and get their data up to a year down the road, it is incredibly hard to get high response rates with those highly mobile learners after they leave the program. So all these data are entered into the state's data management system, and then they get aggregated up to the state level before being reported to the federal adult ed agency each fall. So that, in a nutshell, is the data that is available through federally funded programs and also usually state-funded programs, which might not get federal funding, but they tend to collect and use the same data. So all that is available. If you can talk a state into partnering with you.
Stephanie, I'm going to follow up with a question from Nason, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but I think this is a question that lots of folks might have, which is how well are the is the progression of students tracked through the pipeline? So in terms of course completion, certificate completion, et cetera. So like the longitudinal collection of data.
Well, most states do not have longitudinal data systems, but when somebody stops out and then they come back, a lot of the data systems will flag those people because this is so common in adult ed. Most of the data systems are designed to flag people who look a lot like someone who is already in the system. That doesn't mean that you never get sort of disconnected records in the system, but it does cut it down.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Okay, so Judy, I'm interested in maybe if you could share with the group some of the key methodological challenges that your team has run into in conducting evaluation studies in adult education.
So what I'm going to do actually, Vivian, is not focus on the methods exactly first, because we're going to talk about some of that in our panels. But I wanted to talk about overarching challenges, which I think particularly if studies are not planned and set up correctly, it kind of goes downhill from there. And so we've learned a fair amount about how to work with adult education programs and staff and with the state in doing that. In this heterogeneity of learners, staff, programs, content, services, and community resources really suggests that researchers have to begin planning a study by spending time developing in-depth knowledge about the operational characteristics of the prospective study sites, especially the backgrounds and experience of staff. And in the case of intervention research and authentic study in settings, you have to look at the operational requirements of the intervention to be tested. And so knowledge of the State Adult Education's Office special projects and priorities also can be informative, because that gives you kind of an understanding what's going on at the local level. And particularly now, designing the study is a collaboration between researchers and practitioners, and gathering this information will help ensure that the adult ed sites have the structure and operating conditions. So I've picked out a couple of challenges. One is how to obtain the site buy-in when there are time and other commitments needed from staff to implement the study. So if a site's leadership and staff do not have a realistic information about the length of the study and the time required for staff to conduct activities such as responding to data requests, doing class observations, interviews, etc., or participating in professional development to learn how to deliver the study intervention, very often they decide to not participate in the study after you've already started to begin. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen. A related issue is whether the approach or theory that underlies the intervention that's going to be tested is aligned with the program staff's assumptions about practices or learners' capabilities. We haven't talked a lot about that, but a misalignment between what the current staff think and how what that new intervention is proposing can actually result in affect the willingness of the staff to participate. I think that the moral of the story is to really check with staff about the assumptions guiding the study, providing them with realistic timelines and resource requirements, and soliciting their feedback can help ensure a successful study. Determining the length and structure of a study or intervention to maximize the amount of dosage study participants can receive is important to ensure that the study timeline and intervention dosage will work. Researchers sometimes have to work with the program staff to implement slight changes in schedules, or may need to adjust some of the study's assumptions to match the implementation schedule for study sites. And we can see that there's tension there. And then another one is for intervention sites, structuring the intervention to ensure that staff can implement it with high fidelity because of the diversity of staff and backgrounds and experience. It's very helpful to have an assessment or some kind of measure of staff's knowledge relative to the type of intervention that you're introducing into the program to figure out whether those staff are ready to even be trained to implement the particular intervention. And also because adult ed staff have had limited experience implementing structured curricula, there may be resistance to following criteria for high fidelity. And I think increasingly what we see is really helpful when the researchers can figure out some aspects of the intervention that can be implemented with more flexibility. So really understanding what those key elements are, the intervention that are expected to cause the change is helpful, and then give a little flexibility in between. Finally, predicting and measuring the range of factors that may affect learners' participation and success, such as psychosocial skills and possible barriers to participation. Many factors can account for adults' lack of engagement or learning or achieving their goals. And it's important to gather information in planning the study about site staff's perceptions of those factors that may cause students to disengage so that they can be measured as part of the study and then goes into those moderation analyses.
That's great, Judy. Thank you so much. Stephanie and Daphne, do you want to add some sort of experiences that your team have had in making in methodological challenges that you've encountered in your studies?
I'm gonna go first, Daphne. I will go.
Yes, please do.
In our IES-funded adult ESL literacy impact study, we faced a lot of the type of challenges we're talking about today, particularly heterogeneity and high mobility, with the added difficulties in working with learners who had not yet attained literacy in their native language or English, and who also had not yet learned to speak or understand the English language. The intervention that we were testing was designed to help them develop their decoding skills and improve their reading and therefore ability to benefit from their English language instruction. Because it's kind of hard to learn a new language if you cannot read and write. The first challenge we experienced related to heterogeneity and working with these literacy learners was during site recruitment. We had learned in an earlier study with similar learners that ESL programs, at that time at least, did not typically differentiate between literacy and English speaking skills. So learners would come in and be placed in courses based on their English language proficiency. And because ESL programs can have learners with anywhere from no formal education to advanced degrees in the same classroom, the variability in native literacy was substantial. So because our intervention was not appropriate for these more educated, more literate learners, we had to collaborate with the programs to consider educational background or other proxies for literacy that they were willing to use in making placement decisions for study classes. So this helped us reduce some of the heterogeneity in literacy levels. Of course, there was plenty of heterogeneity left, but this required us to provide training for the intake staff and teachers to help them recognize English language learners with emerging literacy skills. And as you might expect, another big challenge was to assess the literacy and language skills of these learners. First, there were no existing reading assessments designed to be used with these no or non-literate ESL learners. So we had to work with some very talented assessment experts to identify the most appropriate tests available and adapt the administration protocols to work with them. So for example, we had to translate instruction into many different languages and provide instructions verbally and administer them one-on-one. So it's very resource intensive. To pull this off and help the learners feel more comfortable, we collaborated with the programs to identify and train staff or former higher level learners to help do the data collection. And an additional challenge we ran into that affected how we approached designing the study, doing the random assignment and timing post-testing, was the high level of mobility in this population. So in general, at least half of adult ed learners will not persist long enough to be post-tested, and that's just a national average. And many prospective learners will enroll, but then not end up attending class. So for this reason, we use program data from the prior year as our anticipated attrition in our updated power analyses after recruitment. And then we tried to actively reduce study attrition by waiting to randomly assign learners until the first day they arrived for class, rather than assigning them when they were enrolled. That is really critical. And we had study staff on site for the first 2 weeks of class to work with program intake staff to conduct the random assignment. So we did not randomly assign them until they actually showed up to start attending classes. And then other strategies we used to reduce the impact of learner mobility was to use program data from the prior year to identify time periods with large amounts of program attrition and work with the local staff to schedule our post-testing right before those periods. But if learners left before we could do that, we would work with the local staff who had a relationship with the learner to reach out and schedule post-testing with them. The downside of testing learners a little bit earlier than we would like to is that they don't get the intended amount of dosage, which of course can mute the impact of the intervention. However, we did manage to post-test at least 80% of our study participants, which was pretty remarkable with this population. So we're pretty happy about that. Daphne was on our twig. I think Becca Maynard was on our twig. So you guys know what we were trying to do and what we accomplished.
And I guess it's my turn, but Stephanie, what you accomplished was amazing.
Oh, Daphne, we're having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
That's better. Yeah,
Good.
maybe a little closer to the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So anyway, I'm going to give examples of challenges from an intervention study where learners and teachers were randomly assigned to one of 6 conditions, focusing on different aspects of reading, including a business as usual condition. And all the classes were intended for 100 hours of instruction. They were taught by our research leaders to students who are reading reading words at 3rd to 5th grade equivalency levels. And the classes met twice a week for 2 hours for each session. Now, adults compared to children know what they want, and if they don't get it, they're going to leave. And we definitely saw that in our study. For example, in our comprehension-focused condition, the adults were upset with how we had framed that. We gave them text to read in that class, but most of the activities around comprehension focused on oral comprehension. And the students were upset because they had enrolled in what they thought were reading classes, and why aren't we focusing on reading? And why are we doing so much oral stuff? No matter how much we tried to explain to them the connection between oral comprehension, reading, and reading comprehension, it didn't matter. and they voted with their feet. So much so that we actually dropped that condition from our study. Another challenge that I encountered in this study was, what do you do about the fact that the intervention is designed for 100 hours, but because of the different types of attendance patterns that I kind of described a little bit in the beginning, it's taking everybody different amounts of time to get to that 100 hours. So what we decided to do was to just keep running the class as long as we could run the class. And as each person reached the 100 hours, we post-tested them. What we also found was that students who had reached the 100 hours wanted to stay in the class anyway, even though we no longer considered them as part of the research study, because they felt they were benefiting from the class. And so of course we let them stay. And anyway, that's how we kind of got around to getting most of our students post-tested as close as possible to the 100 hours by just not ending when we had taught for 100 hours. The other thing that we realized we had to do was to develop a very strict kind of procedure and policy around attendance from an administrative point of view. We had a policy where the research teachers would reach out to any student who was absent for the first time. Then the second time, consecutive time, they would reach out to them again. If they were out for 3 consecutive times, then our project coordinator reached out to them. And then if they were still out for consecutive times, I reached out to them. So we were very, very strategic and very labor intensive in terms of reaching out to students. We often found that students wanted to come back, but they felt embarrassed that they had missed class or were concerned that they wouldn't be able to, etc. Despite all of this, we experienced a lot of attrition between screening and our data analysis. And I'm going to now devote the rest of my time to talking about that. Screening, by the way, can be very important for adult ed researchers, depending on their research project. So I often am interested in underlying processes of reading, the kind of nuanced information that's not provided by the adult literacy test that the adult ed programs provide, administer. And so a student can be placed, let's say, in a class that supposedly is appropriate in terms of the grade level, but when I administer my test, measuring that specific underlying skill, I find that there's a mismatch. So in fact, in this study, we had to screen 1,174 people who tested on their standardized adult ed test at the 3rd to 5th grade levels, but only 629 qualified in terms of their word reading levels for my purposes. Then out of the 629 who qualified, only 428 showed up for pre-testing, only 395 attended the first day, only 277 persisted through the midpoint, 256 showed up for post-testing. Because of all the different kinds of attendance patterns, we had very strict rules in terms of what we would consider as the minimum number of hours at midpoint, at post-test, and between midpoint and post-test. And to make a long story short, out of the 1,174 people we screened, we ended up with 198 people for our analysis. So I will stop there and let you take it over, Vivian.
And Judy, would you like to add any comments?
Sure. I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes on the intervention research in particular. And the issue is when you're testing, your intervention is a supplement to what else is going on. And we did a study, we started with the pilot study on the use of text messaging to prompt adults' participation in GED, completion of GED and enrollment in college. And the intervention was the text messaging. And then what we did was to look at how that text messaging was used in combination with facilitators' general guidance. So this was a small study. We had 6 programs in 1 state. And through prior research that I had done under IES funding, we figured out that there was something going on where students who should be taking the GED weren't. They should be qualified to do that, et cetera. So text messages were developed that reflected what everyone thought were the key pain points, if you will, why students weren't engaging, you know, why they were leaving, and the facilitators were trained to do that, those text messages, so that they were listed out. And the students were randomly assigned to either the treatment condition, which was the text messaging with regular guidance, or the control condition was just the regular guidance. And when we looked at the impact results, showed no differences in GED attainment or enrollment in college. We then analyzed the text message data, and we saw that half of those facilitators only sent 2 text messages, which was not what they had been asked to do. So it was essentially they didn't really implement the intervention as intended. The other 3 facilitators did send text messages, and 2 of those 3 sent multiple messages that were very much targeted at whatever the issue was that the learner was having at the time, gave substantial feedback and the like, while that 3rd facilitator, who also had a lot of text messages, was much more general about, you know, the guidance. So we then went outside of the frame of the impact study and looked at the differences between those 2, the outcomes for the students who participated in those 2 heavy dose impact text messaging situations, and they had positive results. So what we concluded from that was it was the intervention itself probably was not robust enough compared to the guidance they were both getting. Half of the facilitators did not implement as had intended, but there was this kernel of hope, if you will, which showed that it looks like there's something going on. So we were then able to conduct another study where we had 10 programs in 4 states, and which is much larger, and it was a descriptive study. And in doing that and in analyzing the text messages from that study, we could see much clearer the range of types of text messages, really what robust text messages look like, and the kinds of problems, because we analyzed conversations, we were coding both what the people delivering the text messages said as well as the students. So the next step would be really to refine that text message intervention a tad, and then to try to go back out and test it experimentally with the concept of, we think that we have found what the secret sauce is. The other thing we came to the conclusion early on was that our hypothesis that text messaging was going to affect high stakes changes such as GED attainment or enrollment in college was not the right way to think about it. Rather, the text messaging is affecting micro behaviors, if you will, the many steps that students go through as they participate in adult education to get to those larger outcomes. And we would love to be able to measure, so this is a measurement issue, what those many steps are as they go along, and then look at that combined with their academic background and all those other variables, which are stronger predictors of outcomes in high stakes, environments.
That's great. Thank you, Judy. Okay, so what I want to do is we have about 25 minutes or 20 minutes left for this session, and I want to make sure that we provide an opportunity in case any of our panel attendees would like to either share any sort of experiences that they may have as sort of challenges that they may have in terms of doing methodological work in adult ed settings, or if you are working on the methodology side, if you would like to sort of share some of the work maybe that you're doing that might have relevance to what you're hearing today, or if you have a question or comment about things. So let me just pause for a moment and ask if there's anybody who would like to offer any comments or questions or reflections.
Hey, Vivian, I think there was a comment from Charles in the comments we might want to read that for the people that don't have access to the chat.
Yes, yes.
And then we have a question in the Q&A that we can come to after Charles's comment.
That's great. Thanks, Meredith. So Charles asks if there's a methodological need for modeling peer effects in this kind of adult learning class, where learner-learner interactions are key and students will stay on after getting the whole dose, i.e. a model that estimates the effect of speaking with peers who have had 150 plus hours of instruction on average versus say just under 100 hours on average. So this is a question about whether or not, I think whether peer effects, or is that included as part of the treatment or as part of the intervention? And if there's research on sort of the role that the composition of the class plays. Charles, I saw that you just came on. If you wanted to add to your question, feel free to jump in here.
More than happy to. I think that was exactly it. Just thinking about people who were right there at the kind of scheduled time for the post-test, getting in some sense maybe a different treatment than people who had peers on and that had learned on their own. And just this seems like a thing that might be of interest to methodologists as well, because it's, you know, I think the question's easy to ask, but getting good estimates for that with good standard errors is probably a challenge.
I think this is a great question. I mean, it's a pretty common instructional technique in adult ed, especially in ESL. And I think it definitely is an area of promise.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this because, you know, that you guys talked about attrition as being such a big issue. And so one of the questions that I had, which I'm sure, and Judy, I think some of the work that you talked about started getting at this, is sort of understanding why, you know, why students attrit from programs, but also whether exploring if interventions themselves might reduce the attrition. And then in thinking about sort of some of the contextual work that we've looked at, just the role that your peers might play in terms of supporting and encouraging people to stay in their program or to, you know, continue seems to have such a high role. So I'm just curious about if that work has been looked at or done. Judy, go ahead.
I can tell you it certainly does affect how you recruit students. The peers have a big, and when we've always asked our recruiters to talk individually to students, and the few times where they haven't done that, and when you go in and if somebody doesn't want to do it, that just it's a negative effect on participating in studies anyway. I think it also depends on the energy of the teacher and the kinds of instructional methods the teacher uses on engagement. And I've, you know, observed hundreds of classes over the years, and you can see real differences. What we haven't done is measure that very well, to tell you the truth. What I think is even more interesting now are the hybrid and then the online classes, and that'll give us an opportunity not to be inventive about how we do that, but this will be, I think, the future of what we have
as part of the context, right? The hybrid that automatically either sort of facilitates sort of peer involvement or not. And here, what I would also emphasize is that this is an area of work that would really benefit from working collaboratively with a methodologist on the design end, because you can design multi-level experiments where part of the question is to not only look at the intervention effect, but to also investigate spillover effects that might happen sort of in the classroom itself. So yeah, this is a ripe area. I want to turn to Aiden since I see his hand up. Or her. I apologize. I'm sorry.
No, it's actually a boy's name in Turkish, if you believe it. So anyway, I think what I'm going to build on what Judy said. There's definitely the peer help when it comes to recruiting participants for a program. Another big issue is, and we talk about it all the time, but we don't really measure it or define it. Classroom climate is really important. You know, we always talk about a supportive class where peers help each other. And I have observed classrooms where peers know each other really well. Sometimes they are relatives, so it also helps. And if somebody doesn't show up, then they call each other and say what's going on. So those kinds of environments are really helpful, but we have no way of judging that class climate. So, you know, peer researchers, Charles, if you do work on this, how do you evaluate the support level of a classroom, how peers support each other? I don't have a good answer to that, but I think it's incredibly important, and yet we're not able to document it. And I also had a question for Judy, a quick question. How did you analyze the content of all the texts? Did you use an automated system or?
No, we were old school for a couple of reasons. One was we did conversations. And so you had to organize. It was very labor intensive, I might add, but we had to organize them in a way and then, you know, follow it through. And then we, you know, had reliable coding and the like, but it took some time. But it was very informative. I actually read through 1,500 different text messages because I was very curious to get a sense. I think the next time we would obviously go to some kind of automized, you know, coding. But because this was all new and we really wanted to understand what was going on, I think the first time around it was okay to do that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think that this is an area of work that is, you know, the holy grail has been just trying to be able to understand some of the classroom processes that are happening in K-12, but certainly also in post-secondary and in adult learning environments. And this is where I feel like sort of both technology for being able to capture some of these conversations, but also some of our data science colleagues who have expertise in being able to process text data in sort of quick ways and be able to provide sort of feedback for both the researchers and to the interventionalists who are in the classrooms about what's happening in the classroom could be a really promising area of work. Daphne, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to some of the comments. So Charles, you're absolutely spot on. So for example, with recruitment, as Judy said, what I tell my recruiters are that if you can get one person to say yes, you're going to get a whole lot of people to say yes. If you scare away one person, you can consider the whole program as off limits at that point. I mean, that's how closely connected the peers are in these programs. And also what we've noticed but never measured, and we probably should, is that in some classes, as Aiden mentioned, there is already a close network. And in those classrooms, often the peers have a better shot at getting a student who's been out to come back in, because they can brainstorm with the student about, hey, yeah, I can pick you up, or I know somebody who can help watch your kid, and so forth and so forth. And I just wanted to end with one last comment that you're absolutely right. One neglected area that we really haven't paid much attention to is makeup of the class. And I'm actually now involved with a team that is trying to design a study with a very big data of looking at the composition of students in the classroom to see how that interacts with gain. So for example, what does it mean if you have students that are similar in age versus all over in age? Does that affect the outcomes and so forth? So yeah, thank you, Charles. All that's really critical.
Meredith, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because we have a question in the Q&A and
Yep.
some questions have come up in the chat. And so I want to make sure, because this is great. Like we're getting where we wanted to get, and that's like sort of this like, oh, what about this? What about this? Like turning those ideas. So maybe I'll go ahead and read one of the questions in the chat, and Vivian, you can read the question in the TA, and
Yeah,
maybe the
that sounds great.
panelist, if it just one of you could address the question, and then we can always follow up in the chat to continue these conversations. But the question from Sandy in the chat was following up on a prior question. Are there examples of programs that use extrinsic incentives for participants to get to a certain point in the program, complete it, or demonstrate learning gains? And the interest here is, like using maybe behavioral economics to promote attendance. Are there models of that? And so if one of the panelists has an example, that'd be great. Or if there's nothing that anybody knows, maybe that's something we can consider too. And lower my hand.
It's not exactly an extrinsic incentive, but programs have reorganized, particularly in community colleges, the length of the instruction, where if it was a term or it was a semester, they made it shorter because they looked at the disengagement data. And so part of this is making sure that there is some explicit feedback, some kind of reward. I know that some programs may give badges or things like that. I haven't seen any of that in our studies, but definitely giving some incentive and feedback that is pretty concrete so that students want to continue for the next, first 5 weeks, the next 5 weeks. I think that part of the issue is trying to be flexible. CBOs, community-based organizations, are the most flexible because they're not in a larger system. Programs in community colleges are probably the least flexible. So I think part of this is the setting in which the programs take place and how inventive the staff can be to making sure that they understand, what will motivate students to keep continuing.
Judy, can I follow up with that question? So my familiarity with sort of the badges is in sort of the area of teacher preparation and working with teachers and having teachers sort of earn either certificates or badges because, for professional reasons. And so I was wondering about the participants in your population. Do they, like, these badges and these like external certifications seem like they might have leverage if folks are coming in the same, like they're working in the same sort of discipline or the same area? Do your folks come from all sorts of backgrounds and go into all sorts of different career trajectories, right, or how does that?
I mean, part of this would be, I'll give you an example where it might work. If for the integrated education and training programs where they're simultaneously learning an occupational skill and basic skills there, contextualized. If that is a shorter program, they then end with some type of a certificate, of sorts, and then that allows them to go and act on that. I'm not sure, I think programs make up things, if you will, as an extrinsic rewards, as opposed to what you're talking about, Vivian, which is more of a formal process. I personally think that this whole thing about academic self-efficacy is at the heart of why people do not stay, and that we haven't given enough thought to that and operationally define that so that it really can be a very robust process in teaching and learning. Because when you observe classes for a long time, you see that, and then they can go for weeks without getting any feedback.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising.
So let me follow up here, because I think this is related from our Q&A from an anonymous participant who says, I'm new to adult education. With all of challenges, I'm wondering what the role is for RPPs and participatory research models, collaborating with teachers and students on choosing interventions most relevant to local contexts and exploring troubleshooting various research designs and study implementation methods in collaboration together. So I thought about this when I can't remember who was talking about that they brought an intervention in, and it turned out some of their participants, they said that this is not the intervention that I want. And so I'm curious to hear about, well, first, how, do you have a participatory approach in terms of develop, or have there been examples of such?
Yeah, so when we did that study, we didn't involve learners in from the very beginning. But in future studies, since then, I always have learners who are advisors and actual adult literacy teachers who are advisors as well. And that helps make whatever we want to test more authentic and more relatable, I guess, to the students. And I think a lot of it goes back to what Judy said, that you have to make sure that whatever you are promoting in your research project is aligned to what the staff are doing in the program and what the learners want.
Great. Does anybody want to add any additional thoughts to that? I'll say that I think I'll follow up with folks here, but I remember talking to folks who were working with sort of indigenous populations and tribes, and their whole intervention model was around basically adaptive interventions that allow sort of their community members or tribal members to be able to choose sort of how the interventions would actually be implemented in their community. And what got randomized actually was the adaptation, or the allowing sort of folks to be able to adapt or choose what, how to actually roll out the intervention in field settings. And I wonder if maybe, this is, I think, also an area of research, right? That in terms of thinking, I think in an RCT world, we get so used to thinking about how we need to control all of these different aspects. But I think what we're hearing more and more from folks in the field is that they need flexibility in order to be able to meet sort of the things in their needs. So, okay, let's see, Meredith, let me check in with you about if there are any other questions or comments that are from the group that I've missed for now.
There was a little conversation going on around the link between adult learners' social capital and opting into and persisting in programs. I think we kind of hit on that, but I don't know if there was a follow-up there.
Okay.
Okay.
So and what I did see in the chat too is that I saw a couple of folks who are here who are qualitative researchers, and so and I think it's important that we have sort of both qualitative and quantitative folks on the ground. And I wanted to ask folks about, do you guys incorporate qualitative research as part of your evaluation studies, and how do you do so?
Yeah, I mean, we have all the studies I've done are mixed methods. So there's a lot of observation, there's interviews, there's a lot of discussions, I think. So we're collecting lots of different perspectives. I do think that we probably going forward need to spend more time. If we have an intervention that we think we want to test, you just can't arrange to go implement it. You really, that day is no longer. You have to spend a lot of time with numerous programs, if you will, to see, is this the kind of intervention from their experience they think will make sense, and do a much more talk about collaboration. It really does have to be all over the place. And I think also talking to the students. The students are very clear about when they're learning and when they aren't. At all levels. We found that we were doing a very low level literacy study, and all of the interviews were right on point. The students could identify exactly what they learned and what they didn't learn. So that's, I think, an optimistic view that going forward, there's a lot more tools we can apply to this.
Oh, go ahead, Daphne. Daphne, you're muted right now, and if you're speaking, or
yes, I actually had a question for the group, but if you want to follow up on what Judy said, go for it.
No, go ahead, please. I think we're at our last 5 minutes now, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious if people are from other fields. Is there anything that we shared today that resonates with you, that's similar to the kinds of challenges you have in your field? How have you gone around meeting those challenges, or is anything that we shared today really unique? It's like, wow, thank God we don't have to deal with that. I'm just curious what kind of reactions people have in general to what we shared vis-a-vis to what you deal with on a day-to-day in your research.
I'm going to pause for a moment and allow if anybody wants to. Well, Daphne, I'll share with you one of some reflections that I've had. So first of all, I work mostly with folks either in early ed, which has a fair amount of sector heterogeneity, as well as in K-12 and special ed. And I would say that my breath was taken away in terms of what you described to me in terms of the types of characteristics of the heterogeneity characteristics that you describe for both your populations and your settings. One thing that I have spent a lot of time sort of thinking about has been that, you know, like I said at the beginning in our framing comments, that, you know, the goal, our goal has often been sort of thinking about what's the average treatment effect of some intervention, right? And where I think we as a field has not been as good at, has been sort of characterizing what is that an average effect for what or whom, right? And that really matters a lot if there is a great deal of heterogeneity in terms of both participant characteristics and setting characteristics, right? Because, and we think that treatment effects really vary a lot, right? So I think I've spent a lot of time sort of thinking about, well, we have study results from one study that is on, and we have results from a different study that is around a similar sort of intervention. And meta-analysis can sort of help us get what the average effects are, but it's hard for us to really be able to characterize like how exactly is your effect different from my effect, right? And if they are different, then what explains that difference in effects? So I think I sort of feel invigorated by the opportunity to really think about how do we characterize what those effects are in terms of describe it, like in describing them. And that does require really intense collaboration, I think, between sort of folks who do methodological work and folks who do substantive work, that we have to really understand what are those moderators, what are the things that really are driving sort of potentially differences in effects here. And, you know, I think as sort of stats people, we want to just make assumptions about things, but in this case, like if you're interested in effect heterogeneity, you have to really understand the context and what's driving those things. And so that opens up also opportunities, I think, for qualitative researchers, for sort of folks who do data science work that could bring in sort of, you know, rich video data and text data. So I don't know, I'm excited about those opportunities. I think we are at time. Are we at time here?
I think so, because I'm getting pinged that I need to go to another session. This is Meredith. This has been really fun. You know, like I thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panel for sharing your rich research histories. Thank you, Vivian, for stepping up and saying like, yeah, I think methodologists might actually have a lot of fun in this space. Like this is what we do. And really, this is something that it's not going to go away. We're going to have this need. We've had this need for at least my entire tenure here. And I walked into something, they're like, yeah, we still haven't figured out how to move things forward. There is a lot of work that can happen that could really just transform research methods, analyses, how we even like think about doing this work. Instead of just being consultants, no, you're drivers of change. And also like for the adult ed world, like what if we built the model on the heterogeneity of adult ed instead of K-12? Like how could that just transform the entire way we look at things, right? And then heterogeneity being that thing that we don't touch, it's the very thing that like we are motivated to do and to figure out. So please keep this conversation going. If you're going to a network meeting after this with Charles, maybe this is something you can talk about. And the same thing, if there's another network meeting, or reach out to me and I can help connect you to people. That is what you guys pay your taxes for. So let me help connect you. And thank you all so much. This has been a lot of fun for me, at least. Thank you.